We talked last time about the judges, the kings, and the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, and about the way in which that prophetic voice has been used into the contemporary period outside of the Jewish sphere in projects that Jews themselves might think of as tikkun olam, or repairing the world. Remember that tradition. And this takes mostly the form of social justice movements within our contemporary world. In this lecture, we'll go back to the period of the Babylonian exile to look at the effects that this exilic period has had through the centuries and into the contemporary Jewish world. So exilic is an adjective that comes from exile, so exilic period. Now, many of you know the Melodian song. It's been redone a number of times, By the Rivers of Babylon. I think Jimmy Cliff redid it, and or Matisyahu's Jerusalem. I'll post links to both of these music videos. And so, whether you're aware of it or not, you've been introduced through popular culture to the dismay and determined hopefulness that pervaded the Israelite community following the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. At that time, the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple, took slaves, and sent the people, now known as the Jews, after the southern kingdom of Judah. So now we have the name the Jews, sent those folks into exile. Now, not all Jews at the time were exiled. Mostly the Babylonians booted the well-off. They kept the peasants and the farmers that were needed to do the manual labor of the kingdom. Now, remember that the northern kingdom, Israel, we'll put it up here because we think of north as above south. Remember that northern kingdom, Israel, had already been dispersed by the Assyrians. This is the end of the southern kingdom, or Judah. And it was a devastating experience. Since the time of the Deuteronomic reform, which was let's go new on that, 621 BCE, that's the Deuteronomic reform, all sacrifice had been centralized in the temple, and rural priesthoods had been abolished. So sacrifices centralized. That means the temple was really important. I mean, it was where sacrifice, where the most direct communication between the Israelites and their God, it's where it happened. And all the rural priesthoods at this time had been abolished. So this reform was considered a genuine ethical advance towards justice. And in many ways it really was. But at the same time, people had to travel to Jerusalem. And they experienced through this a real loss of intimacy with their religious leaders. That intimacy began to be regained after the Deuteronomic reform through rabbis or teachers, who we'll talk about throughout today's lecture. Local teachers who led Torah study in small communities. After the Babylonian exile, and I just can't say this enough, the temple is gone. The only place where sacrifice is permitted is gone. The central link between the Israelites and their God is gone. So two major influences that have come down to the present from this. First, the Jews are at this point defined by a sense of exile from God. The hope is always to return, and the essential commandment is to love God, as Deuteronomy 6:5 tells us. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength. And this means not just what you think, but what you do. You love your God through the active relationships that you have with your human community and with the rest of the world that surrounds you. And the goal of daily experience is to walk in the way of the Lord. That's how Jews seek to return from this sense of exile, to return to their God. Now, the second major influence is that when the temple was off limits, the synagogue was born. At the synagogue, Sabbath readings, meals, and teachings are held. More attention is paid to the oral Torah, which we'll talk about later, and it's written down, lest it be forgotten. Remember that for many rabbis, the oral Torah was received along with the written law, or written Torah, was received on Sinai by Moses in one great divine download, but it had been passed down orally. It had been part of a conversational movement, and this was an attempt, during this period of dispersal and everyone's going every direction, and we don't know what's going to happen to this conversation that we've spent hundreds of years cultivating. It starts to get written down, codified. We'll turn to that in a bit. Through writing and study, through the synagogue, and through the increasingly important role of the oral Torah, a post-exilic Jewish national identity is born. Now, eventually, the Emperor Cyrus allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem, where they reinstate temple sacrifice and where there's a great deal of tension. between the Jews who were allowed to stay during the exile and who intermarried during this exilic period to, they married folks who weren't Jews. Um, Tension between them and the Jews who had left or who had gone and then returned and during their exile had maintained a really strong sense of Jewish cultural identity. So those two groups all of a sudden were together again, and there was a lot of tension. As you might imagine, it takes decades of infighting, but eventually a second temple is built. And in 430 BCE, this is an important moment in the text. Ezra reads the books of the law in public. He publicly reads them, and at that point, a newly self-conscious, newly centered theocratic state is inaugurated. What is theocratic? It is God, run by God. So it's organized by and ruled over by God. And a nice contemporary example of this might be Iran, where you do have the kind of politics and religion is intertwined. It's of a piece. It is the same. So that's what happened here. And the state turns really insular. It turns in on itself. Foreign wives are divorced and sent back to their fathers. And Judaism finds its center once more in the Torah. But they continue temple sacrifices until the Hellenizing influence. This means Greek, but it's not just Greek. Politically, it's also Greek culturally, the kind of ideological sway of that Greek impulse. The Hellenizing influence takes over, and in 167 BCE, Antiochus IV, who was a Seleucid, and that made him an inheritor. Seleucid, Antiochus is his name, the fourth. An inheritor of Alexander the Great's kingdom. So he comes in and defiles the temple by constructing a pagan altar in the temple and sacrificing the very not kosher animal of pig on it, and then forcing Jews to self-identified and really, pious Jews to eat of this non-kosher animal that had been sacrificed in the temple to a pagan god. And the book of Maccabees details many stories about this and about the martyrdoms that came out of it. It's very against Jewish law, and it was revolted against in many ways by folks like Judas Maccabeus, a charismatic and militarily effective Jew who leads a revolt, takes back the temple in 165 BCE, and inaugurates through that the Hasmonean dynasty, which will, for about 100 years, rule Jerusalem. So rule Israel for about 100 years until the newly ascendant Romans take over in 63 BCE. Now, we'll return to that story when we look at holidays, as events that took place there are the foundation for the very popular contemporary holiday of Hanukkah. But right now we're looking at the Romans. And when I say newly ascendant, I mean, if you know your classical history, it's sort of, there's this Greek empire and it's flourishing and it's cultural and it's wonderful. As their power goes down, the Greeks go down, the Romans come up. And so relations between the Romans and the Jews were never really good, but they grew increasingly hostile until 66 CE, when the Jews led a massive revolt against Roman rule and destroyed much of Jerusalem in the fighting that happened. And tensions continued to escalate until 70 CE, and this is what the image shows us, when Romans destroyed the Second Temple and completely looted it. And when the Romans rebuilt Jerusalem, it had been thoroughly destroyed. They rebuilt it, but the Jews were no longer allowed entry into their holy city, except for once a year on the anniversary of the destruction of the temple. Jews were allowed to return into Jerusalem and lean against the standing remnants of the temple, that what we know as the Western Wall. They were allowed to come in and lean against that wall, that broken relic of a wall, and weep for what had been lost, and they were charged a fee to do it. So for a fee, they could come in and weep. It's the Romans. So from that point on, there's no more temple. Though some would like a new one, it has not been rebuilt. It doesn't look like it's going to be rebuilt anytime soon. And Rabbinic Judaism. Since there is no temple, Rabbinic Judaism has been the mainstream Judaism into the modern period. After the Second Temple is gone, no more Temple Judaism. Now everything that follows is Rabbinic Judaism. So all the branches we'll look at today, all Rabbinic Judaism. They can be held under that umbrella. So rabbis, like we've seen, emphasize the oral Torah, which they believe, again, was transmitted to Moses on Mount Sinai at the same time as the written law. And the Talmud is the written form of the oral Torah, which you can see from this slide is a text set up as a conversation. It's each section that's, look at that page. It's like, who's writing here? Like each of these is, each selection that is put on the page is a contribution from a different rabbi or a different school of rabbis, and all are held on the same page in this dialectical mode. So the text, even in its form, sanctifies doubt and questioning, as the rabbis whose opinions are included are not always, they don't always agree, but they do always try to work to find a way to make the day holy. And to bring themselves and their people back to God. And the Talmud can be seen as a lens through which to read the Tanakh, which is, again, the Hebrew Bible, what Christians will call the Old Testament, much as is the New Testament. The Christian New Testament is also by Christians used as a lens through which to read that Tanakh. This is what the Talmud is for Jews. And while it was completed or sort of tentatively closed in the 6th century CE, it's also always understood to be sort of at its heart an open text, because questions it addresses are questions of life, and the circumstances of life are ever changing. Now, the conversational or dialectic form that the Talmud points to is one aspect of Jewish practice. There's no equivalent in Judaism to something like the Catholic Pope. No central, single, formal authority. Individuals are, as they have been since the time of Adam and Eve, called to engage the word of the Lord, to wrestle with the questions of maintaining justice in a corrupt world, of fostering holiness in this flawed life. Individuals have to do that. So argument continues. It's seen not so much as destructive. It's necessary to the continuation of a living tradition. And so Jews honor that, and they engage in it. So, but that's not to say that nothing unifies Jewish experience. There is the Shema, a prayer taken from Deuteronomy, which we've seen earlier, and which continues to function as a cohesive mechanism across the various branches of Judaism that have developed. A scroll on which is inscribed the Shema, with other textual citations, is inserted into the mezuzah, which you see here, which are affixed to the doorpost of Jewish homes, and which Jews kiss on their way into and out of those homes. So, just to sort of honor the place of their Lord and of their sacred text and of memory in their day-to-day lived, otherwise understood as secular experience. You go out into the world, you don't forget. And a similar scroll is inserted into the phylacteries, which Jews bind to their arms and foreheads as they daven, that's the kind of rocking back and forth, and say their daily prayers. So Shema is the word for hear, hear. So that's the first word of the prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might. And that, you could do worse than understanding the Shema as what sort of unifies Jewish experience. Now, this tradition, unified around the love of God and the aspiration to return to Him through daily acts and personal relationships, was pressured into fragmentation by the developments of modernity. And this is why the separate branches of Judaism began to define themselves as relatively independent groups. So what are these pressures that we talk about? Well, scholars began to look carefully at the archaeological and textual evidence of the past, which seemed to counter Mosaic authorship, for instance, and a lot of other, traditionally adhered to sort of facts. Scientists began reframing the role of the earth and humans in the cosmos, so this sort of 6-day creation and a 7th day of rest seemed less likely to many scientific explanations. Industrialization and democratization placed culturally different groups in really close proximity with one another, and so a kind of difference that you never had to address was all of a sudden in your face. And there were all kinds of other pressures, but that's a really good introduction to the cataclysmic changes that the Jewish community went through with its entry into modernity. The last 3 slides look briefly at different self-defined groups, but it will be brief. Your book also treats of the differences, and the short film posted on Moodle, The Tribe, take a look at that. It'll give you a fuller sense of the broad spectrum of Jewish experience today, but what I'll do here is just point to just 3 of them to give you a sense. So Reform Judaism was the first branch to really define itself explicitly in terms of the modern world. The Reform movement concentrated on ethics as opposed to the miraculous, right? And so they felt comfortable amending tradition to more easily fit in with their contemporary life experience. So kosher laws are often suspended, and circumcision is often not practiced, and Sabbath services are often held on Sundays to make scheduling in a predominantly Christian world easier. Like if your kids want to play soccer, but you're always at shul on Saturday, and then Sunday you're free, but everyone else is at church. This is difficult, and so these are the kinds of we might think of them as mundane, but it's life, right? These are the kinds of pressures that Reform Jews saw as initiating a sort of more modern approach to Jewish experience. Whereas traditionally, whereas traditionally Jewish identity passed through the mother, here to accommodate intermarriage, it can also be passed through the father, so patrilineal descent is accepted, and the Reform movement has accepted a much more modern approach to gender equality. Now, when the first class of Reform rabbis graduated from Hebrew Union College in 1883, the celebratory banquet included a list of dishes that were unambiguously treif, what's known as treif, and it can be spelled differently. It's transliterated, so it can also have a Y or an I. That's an I. The treif banquet. And I recommend you take a look at this. Look it up online. It's 1883. And the list of foods served at this banquet were so not kosher. Everything on there was, it's mixing milk and meat, it's eating bottom dwellers, the whole thing. It's crazy. And so they really weren't shy about, in fact, they were quite assertive, about proclaiming, brazen even, about proclaiming their distance from a great deal of what had been tradition. Now, Masorti or conservative Judaism, Masorti is better because it's not politically conservative. So when we say conservative, don't let your mind go straight to the conservative end of the political spectrum. That's not what's going on. But Masorti or conservative Judaism developed in response to reform. They wanted to modernize their faith as well, but not that much. So for them, the reform movement had a really good idea, but they took it too far. So while the Masorti Jews take up a number of the changes made by the Reform Jews, they sought to define a real middle ground between the modern Reform and the traditional Orthodox. And you can see that the characteristics of that here. And finally, we'll look at Hasidic Judaism, or the Hasids, who are a subgroup of Orthodox Jews seeking to establish communities that are separated from secular culture, believing that such segregation would allow them to develop an infrastructure to more completely practice the traditional faith of their forefathers. And you're thinking, oh, well, that's, in our contemporary sort of melting pot ideal of America, which I'll just tell you is not exactly what goes on, but we like to think it is, we say, oh, segregate yourself into these little communities in, Williamsburg or somewhere in Irvine, and oh, that's not very cool when we think about how America as an ideal is supposed to work. But you got to think about it. If you want to eat kosher food, but you have no kosher deli anywhere near you, it's going to be a real onerous thing for you to take on that law. And so it's just easier if you have that infrastructure built up. If you have a shul close enough or a temple close enough that you can walk to it on the days you're not supposed to be driving. It does help to foster a community bound by a shared sense of ethics and values and practices if y'all live close to each other. So as much as we might want to view this group, as far right on the political spectrum, we want to remember it's very hard to pigeonhole anyone. And this group focuses on the mystical truths and experiences of the Kabbalah, which are seen as open to everyone, and which are accessed not through the intellect, but through emotion, not through the mind, but through the heart. And so these are your dancing rabbis. You see these everywhere. And they've got the pious, the curls, the unshaven curls that come down, and the big hats, but they're just so happy and exuding joy and love. That's what they're about. Now, again, turn to your book and supplementary materials to get a more full sense of how these different communities understood themselves, and you can find that sense there. But next time, closing our look at Judaism, we'll turn to the holidays, so that'll be fun.